we progress through the Egyptian culture, Greek culture, Roman culture, and then through the Middle Ages, and we hit upon the time period which is known as the Renaissance, we see a lot of changes in art. We see a lot of changes not just in art, but also the role of the artist in society and how he's perceived by other individuals within his culture or society. Remember when I showed you the Mona Lisa and Michelangelo's David? I mentioned that Michelangelo and Leonardo both lived the same time period in the Italian Renaissance. Leonardo was a little bit older than Michelangelo, but they were still contemporaries of each other. What I'm showing you here will predate the work of Leonardo and Michelangelo. The one on the left is a fresco. Have you heard the word fresco before? Fresco? Okay, what it is basically is a painting on plaster. There are various types of fresco. It can be painting on plaster while the plaster is still wet, or the plaster can be completely dry before the artist will put the pigment onto the surface of the wall. But basically, a fresco technique does go back to Egyptian time periods. The Egyptians painted on plaster walls. At that time, they were dry plaster. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit of techniques and mediums. We will be concentrating on those also during this week. But as you know, I show you slides and I'm going to tell you how they were made, not just the formal elements and how they were arranged, but how they were made. If you're dealing with painting on plaster, then obviously you're going to have to paint with something that's going to be able to be absorbed into the plaster wall. That would make sense, right? Okay, wouldn't it make sense? Have to be absorbed into the wall. You wouldn't want anything that would be repelled by the plaster or the media repelled from the wall. What we will see is that this time period, the 15th century Italian Renaissance, predates any use of oil paint. All right? How many of you are familiar with oil paint? Okay, you see a lot of that, and you see a lot of paintings that are made out of oil paint. Oil paint is something that did not develop until the 16th century. So when we are looking at these two examples of artwork, they were painted with a media called tempera. You heard of tempera before? Okay, tempera paint. Tempera is something that is taking a natural pigment. Now, what would the pigment be? What is pigment? Okay, the coloring, right. So we're taking natural pigments, which would basically come from natural sources of such as minerals. If you think of specific types of minerals, they could be crushed into a powder and then mixed with something that we call a binder. The binder is what makes this pigment form kind of stick together or hold together. To cavemen, or back in the time of cave art, the craftsman mixed his natural pigment with the bone marrow of the animals that they killed in the hunt. Well, we get beyond that with the Egyptians, and they will start to mix this natural pigment source with egg. Whether it's the yellow or the white, it didn't matter, but they would mix it with egg. And if you can think of how sticky and gooey the consistency of an egg is, imagine just mixing in the crushed powdered minerals to that so that you can get a what we call a malleable product, something that we can then stick a brush in and then use it as a paint. All right, so tempera is something that takes us up through to the development of oil paint, and again, that won't be there until the 16th century. So these are 15th century. Both of them are painted with tempera. Now, generally, you would paint on a wall, and this again is something that goes back to cavemen. The cavemen painted images of the animals on the walls of the cave. You will not start to see the use of canvas, stretched canvas over a wood frame, until the, again, 16th 16th century, very late though 16th century. So again, this would be the time of Leonardo and Michelangelo's time period, a little bit later. Now, both of these are, well actually the one on the left is painted on a plaster wall, okay? This one is located in Rome in the Sistine Chapel. How many of you have been to the Sistine Chapel? Okay. You notice when you go in there, of course, everyone looks up to the ceiling because that's what they, tend to focus on is what Michelangelo painted on the ceiling in the 16th century. But there were several artists who were commissioned in the 15th century to illustrate stories from the life of Christ on the sides of the walls in the Sistine Chapel. Most people tend to ignore those. They're very significant works of art, but they tend to ignore them because everybody's looking up at the ceiling when they walk into this chapel. So this would be a fresco. Since it is painted on a wall, it's also called a mural. Have you heard that before? Mural. A lot of these words that I'm giving you today appear on that study guide, and you can look them up in the glossary. But a mural is basically something that is appearing on the wall. It's a painting on the wall. Okay, the techniques could vary. So it doesn't have to be a fresco on the wall, but basically a mural is just something that's painted on the wall. Also, it could be something painted on the ceiling. So Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling painting would also be a mural. Okay? Now, this one was painted by an artist named Perugino. That's not important to you, but what I want to discuss, starting with the one on the left, is again kind of tying more of the comparative study together. We are entering into a period called the Renaissance. Now, what do you know about the Renaissance? What does that word itself refer to? We say the Renaissance. Do you know how it translates? Okay, right, rebirth. I can't see who said that, but that's correct. A rebirth. It's a rebirth, and for the 15th century, it was a rebirth of the classical past. Okay, when I speak of the classical past, I'm referring to the art of Greece and Rome. All right, we don't get into a lot of art history in this class. All right, so I'm only giving you bits and pieces. If this interests you, or if you want to know more about this, remember the last section in your textbook is a very condensed art history lesson, so you can read that. But what we are seeing is that this rebirth, we're coming out of the Dark Ages, and I know you're probably familiar with a lot of stories about how life was in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. But we're coming out of this time period where every thought process, every action, every political or social action was dictated by the Catholic Church. And what we're seeing with this painting, obviously, since it is in the Sistine Chapel, it is going to deal with something religious as far as Christian religion. And what we're seeing subject matter-wise is we have a figure of Christ here who's delivering the keys to heaven to St. Peter. And it's a literal translation from the New Testament, basically. But what we are seeing as far as a rebirth is that there's a lot of things that are going on technically that are also contributory to this rebirth of the classical past. What we see in the beginning is artists who have this need to express because they are good at it, because they are designated the image maker of the tribe or of that particular culture or town or city, and so they are creating these images. But they're creating these images to fulfill a specific function. Whether, again, it's the funerary mask for King Tut, who was going to see that mask? Only the priests and only the artists or the craftsmen that created it. It wasn't an object that they thought someday would end up in a museum where millions of people every year would come to look at it and admire it as a work of art. We see this also through the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, art fulfills a basic function. function. And for the art of the Middle Ages, it was used as instructional propaganda, basically, for the church. Most people in the Middle Ages could not read or write. If they could read, it wasn't going to do them a lot of good, since there were very few books in the Middle Ages. The books that existed were all hand-copied books, and they were what we call liturgical, which are basically religious texts. So there was a lot of, let's say, stagnation during the Middle Ages as far as creativity, self-expression, self-individuality, because, once again, it was so dominated by the Catholic Church. Art went through a change during this time period, and the art took on the role of the educator. Artists, who again were only looked upon as craftsmen, their role in their culture was to illustrate the Bible. And they had to do this again because books were limited. Most people could not read. So if you're dealing with a clergy of people, a whole congregation of people who could not read or write, and they're coming on a regular basis into the church for the Mass, and they don't have something at home that they can open up and read the Old Testament or the New Testament, they go into the church, and even on the outside of the church, the artists would place artwork and tell stories with their artwork, so that anyone who again, didn't have the ability to read or write could walk into the chapels or the churches, and actually the walls would be a picture book. And they would be able to look at these images, and they would understand that this is relating the story of Christ delivering the keys of heaven to St. Peter. And we would be able to read through our associations. Again, remember associations? Associations are things that we bring into a painting. We would be able to associate the fact that these were the 12 disciples. Okay, all of these figures dressed in the long tunics would be the rest of the 12 disciples. So there are certain symbols that appear within the painting that allows us to interpret the story. Okay, this is important when we're dealing with something that has what we call subject matter. Subject matter is that there is a story to tell, or there's something that we do recognize. We might lose sight of our associative values being in the 20th century and considering this was in the 15th century. Probably, unless you were, very well read in the New Testament, you might not get a clear understanding of what was going on within this work of art. Now, if we compare this to something else that was developing at the same time period, again, both of these are 15th century. This painting is by an artist named Botticelli. Now, Botticelli was someone who did not work for the church in the case of Perugino, but Botticelli worked for a very wealthy family who lived in Florence during the 15th century. Have you heard of the Medici or the Medici family of Italy, of Florence? They were owners of the first World Bank. Now, wouldn't it be nice to be the owners of the very first World Bank? Can you imagine how much wealth this family had? The Medici family of Florence, because they had such great wealth, a lot of times contradicted and struggled with a sense of political power with the Pope. And what we're going to see that by Michelangelo's time period, who do you think is sitting on the chair of the Pope? But a Medici, all right? So we're going to see that wealth and power obviously go closely together. But if we look at what has been painted by Botticelli, this also kind of exemplifies a lot of different things that were happening during the Renaissance. By association, what can we bring into this painting, maybe now in the 20th century, to try to interpret the story? What could we we infer, what could we deduce from just looking and studying what's going on here? Does anyone have a clue or a basic idea? I mean, obviously we can tell this is a nude woman, and she's standing on a seashell, and she's on the water, maybe the ocean. But what do we know about this? What can we bring into this to try to decide what the artist is trying to say here? Yes?
Isn't she supposed to be a goddess?
Okay, right. She is a goddess. Do you happen to know who she might be or which one she might be? Okay, right, Venus. Okay, it's not Venus de Milo, as I showed you with the sculpture. That was specifically, it was representing Venus, but the de Milo part just was because of the location and where it was found. This is considered to be called the birth of Venus. All right, now, how many of you are familiar with Greek mythology or Roman mythology? How was Venus born? And the clues are in the painting.
Was she from an oyster shell?
Okay, yeah, from a conch shell. She was born of the sea foam. She evolved from the sea foam, and she came onto Greece, the country of Greece. She washed up on the shores, southern shores of Greece, on a conch shell. So Botticelli, in knowing Greek mythology, is translating that story with using visual images. And here we have the sea foam. We can see that he's created the sea foam with these white little lines. She's on a conch shell. She is gliding across the water. And how do we know that she's gliding across the water? Because what other clues has he put into the composition? Okay, the wind, right. And how does he personify wind? He uses a male and a female. And how does he show that this is the wind? Can you see the streams coming out? Their cheeks are full as if they're blowing. And you can see this kind of like the air coming from their mouths. Also, notice the direction of how the hair is blowing. So we see through this symbol that it represents wind, and she is floating across or being carried across the ocean. She's about to approach land, and here we have one of the nymphs that is helping her, ready to clothe her and receive her. Now we have what we call a dichotomy. You know what dichotomy is? It's like a contradiction. If we're in the 15th century Renaissance, it is a rebirth of the classical past. Okay, if we take that in a literal sense, the classical past would be going back and reviving everything that happened in Greece and Rome, right? But we're just coming out of a very religious time period, the Middle Ages, which again was dominated by Catholicism. So are we seeing with this painting and this one by Botticelli, we see this contradiction, but what we have to realize is it doesn't mean, though, at this point in time, people are ignoring the church and going back and worshiping the pagan gods and goddesses. That's where the dichotomy comes in. Now, I want to explain something to you. When Botticelli painted this, he was painting it for the Medici family. It was to be placed in the Medici palace, the Medici home, for private viewing, because this painting for that time period would have been considered pornography. All right? It would have been pornography. Now, how do we perceive it today? Do we consider this pornography or to be pornographic? Okay, we don't. Now, why don't we? Why don't we see anything wrong with this? It's just a nice painting of a beautiful nude, right? Okay? We don't see anything, let's say, distasteful about it. It is just a nice painting of a beautiful female nude, okay? For that time period, though, why would they consider it to be pornographic? Because it was nude. Now, let's put ourselves back into the time period. What did most women wear during this time period? We get an idea by looking at these guys here. Look at how the guys dress. Of course, ignore these people. These are historical first century. But look at how the guys dressed here. These are contemporary Florentine Roman citizens. They are fully clothed. How would you guess the women would dress at that time? Even more so fully clothed. Their dresses go all the way to the floor, do not show your legs, do not show your ankles, do not show your wrists, do not go anywhere without your head covered. You know, there were so many restrictions placed on how a woman should appear in public, and everything from head to toe had to be covered. So if we start to then understand, okay, well maybe I can see why this would be considered pornographic for that time period, we would never go into a church and see nudity unless it was who? Eve, okay? Eve or Adam. Now, why is it okay for us to go into a church and see nudity if it's Adam and Eve? Okay, because Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall of man walked around free as a bird. You know, they didn't worry about the fact that they didn't have clothing on. Okay, but what happens with the church, and again, what adds to this contradiction, is that the church is dictating still in the 15th century things should be this way, but yet we have this interest in the classical past. Therefore, artists are starting to go back to the subject matter, the pagan ritual practices of the Greeks and Romans, not to go back and worship these people, but to revive the beauty of the sculptures and the forms that were created during the Greek and Roman time period. Because what happens is they feel, the artists in the Renaissance feel, that a lot of things suffered during the 1,000-year period of the Middle Ages, that the church had so much control over what was said, what was written, what kind of art appeared in the church, that the artist could not be creative. He could not use these creative processes to come up with something that was uniquely his own. So this is why we do see a turning point here, not just because of intellectual change, but also artistic change, and what's most important is this desire for artists to make a statement for themselves. This is the first time throughout the history of art that we see artists struggle to make a name for themselves. This is where you will start to see artists sign their work. All right? They will take enough pride in what they do to actually sign their work. This is why we know more about the artists in the Renaissance than we know prior in history. We have very, very few recorded artists prior to the 15th century. Now, also keeping with this, and we did discuss this last week when I showed you the Mona Lisa, is that could, in the case of Perugino or Botticelli, could they have just said and taken this upon themselves to create these works of art and then go to the church and say, hey, I have an idea for a painting on the walls of your church, let me do it, and if you don't like it, you don't have to pay me? Or did Botticelli paint this in his studio and then go to the Medici family and say, hey, guess what? I painted this great painting. Would you like to see it? Maybe you'd like to buy it. How did they work? They didn't work that way, did they? How did they work? Pardon? Okay, right. They had to get the commission first and a contract, a signed contract. Because, again, they didn't have the monetary resources to just work all day long in their studio painting whatever they wanted to paint and say, great, wow, this is fun. Now let me see if I can sell it so I can pay my rent next month. They wouldn't have had the means to do that. So with Botticelli, he became what we consider to be the court painter to the Medici family. Now, the Medicis were not royalty, but if we translated this to, let's say, a king, the court painter would have been placed on a salary. Okay, he would get an annual salary. He would get very nice living conditions within one part of the palace. And in exchange for this, his job or duty would be to paint paintings. That's all he would do, paint paintings. And in a lot of cases, especially as we get into the Baroque and Rococo time periods, we will see a lot of artists who paint pornography specifically for the private bedchambers of the kings. Now, I want to explain something, though, here with Botticelli's. He did not intentionally paint this to be pornographic. He painted this to show the beauty of Venus and the beauty of the female form. It was not looked upon in the mind as being pornographic except for the church. All right? Obviously, though, you wouldn't be able to have this in public view. All right? But private residential chambers, residential use, sure, they have it in the Medici's villa, and they have invited guests over. And for the women, sure, they might look at it and kind of be shocked by it. But it was, again, it wasn't looked upon as being a tool for pornography. We're going to discuss this in greater detail later because it's a sensitive issue, and also your book has an essay that I'm going to have you read on censorship. It's an issue. What is pornographic and what isn't? It's all in the mind. It's how you perceive it. It's how you look upon it. If you look upon something and in the mind, in your mind, it is pornographic, it is pornographic, and no one can say to you it is or it isn't. So we'll discuss this. It's just a topic to put on the back burner for now. But when he painted this, when Botticelli painted this, what he was doing is he was reviving the interest in Greek and Roman mythology. Not again to revive it as a religion, but just revive it as an interest, because there was a lot of beautiful artwork that was created in that time period that was lost during the time period of the Middle Ages because the church said, we can't, we don't want anything around that reminds us of the paganism and the idol worshiping that went on under the Roman Empire. Now, another thing that we will see is that from this point, artists will start to push this issue of nudity in art. Notice how Botticelli arranges the woman where she is very kind of like demurely trying to cover her breasts and cover her pelvic area. She's very demure about it. It's not that she's appearing to be ashamed, but she's appearing to be kind of like, modest. That would be a better word. She's showing her modesty about her nudity. There will be artists who start to push this. Michelangelo was one of them. When Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he was highly criticized by the Pope, who commissioned him to do that because his figures were nude. Not just Adam and Eve in the garden, but a lot of the other figures were nude. And the church kept saying to him, Michelangelo, you better do something about that nudity before we reopen this chapel for public worship. And he refused. He took a stand and he refused. This was, maybe one of our, he was a very rebellious individual anyway, but he took a stand against nudity. And when he returned 30 years later to paint the back wall in the Sistine Chapel, he again continued. It was a new pope who commissioned him to do this, but he took a stand and he said, I am not going to clothe my figures. And he stuck behind that and stuck behind that. And what happened is after his death, the Pope at that time hired an artist to come in, and guess what they did? They covered him with drapes, little scarves, and fig leaves. And this is where we see the development of the fig leaf. The fig leaf was brought in as an afterthought. Let's cover the areas that might be a little, too risque. So, two different paintings, same time period, but two totally different paintings as far as the story behind them, economic factors, religious factors, etc., etc. Let's talk about the composition in both. Okay, composition is again relating to formal elements, and we'll start with the one on the left. Now, a lot of these are terms, and again, don't worry if you don't get them right now. Concentrate on the ones that will be on the review guide. But we're dealing with something, let's take this one as an example. I'm just going to point out a couple of things, and some you'll be familiar with, some you may not. In this painting, we can see a distinct foreground, middle ground, and background, okay? A foreground, middle ground, and background is just something that's used by an artist to carry the viewer through the space. That's all he does. Where could we see, or how could we identify the parts in the Botticelli painting? Is there a foreground? What would be included in the foreground? Okay, right. Basically, these two figures are in the foreground. Now, what about the middle ground? Okay, maybe these figures, because they are placed somewhat behind these figures, okay? And parts of the trees are also in the middle ground here. And then what do we see in the background? Okay, right, the horizon in the background. So it's just something that's used to lead your eye through space. Now, when we get this sense of leading our eye through space, other things can come into play here. And I'm going to use this example to illustrate it, and it's covered very thoroughly in your textbook in the first section. And it's called The Rules of Linear Perspective. In your textbook, I believe they show you the example of Leonardo's Last Supper to illustrate this. But how many of you know what linear perspective is, or one-point perspective? It's the same thing. One-point perspective is basically you have one vanishing point that's located either near or on the horizon line, and all lines converge towards that central vanishing point. Our vanishing point in the Perugino painting is located somewhere behind this building. But if we follow the pavement markings, can you see the lines in the pavement? If we followed these directly back into the horizon, they are going to converge onto that single point. It's just like if you're standing on a railroad track right in the middle and you're looking up the track, it appears visually that the tracks meet at a certain point. This is the whole basis of one-point perspective or linear perspective. Now, what happens with linear perspective is that it was discovered in the Renaissance, in the 15th century, by a mathematician and an architect, someone who was working through visually how do we represent things in nature, and he used a mathematical formula to calculate this progression of space, so that we look at this painting and we see that objects in the foreground are larger, objects in the middle ground appear smaller, and as we get onto the horizon, they are even smaller yet. So we get this kind of like sense of scale. Now, what's scale? Scale is how one object in the painting relates to another object. So if we take the example of figures, how do the figures in the foreground relate to the figures in the middle ground and into the background? This is using scale. Do you see how awkward it would be if the artist created this composition and he did a wonderful job of setting out this great sense of distance, but then duplicated the scale of these objects back here on the horizon line? Do you see how awkward that would be? Because in real life, when we look out onto the distance, things get smaller as they go away from us. All right, now again, they didn't know these principles prior to the 15th century. Artists were painting from observation as far as they were trying to look at how they saw things and then translate that into a two-dimensional, or in the sense of sculpture, a three-dimensional image. They're learning as they go along. How is an artist educated up to this point? I don't remember if I mentioned this on Friday. But how did an artist, craftsman, let's say in Egyptian times, how did he learn his craft? Did they have art schools? No, they didn't have art schools. So how do you think he learned his craft? Have you ever heard of a guild system? Okay, guild systems go all the way back into history. Let's use another example. How about let's just stepping back 1 or 2 centuries. If your father was a shoemaker, what did you do when you grew up? You made shoes, all right? So how can we see this translating into how an artist a lot of times receives his training and knowledge? Maybe it's passed on from generation to generation. All right? What if your father is a painter, and we do see this a lot. Your father is a painter, therefore his sons will be trained to be painters. Okay? Let's say in the case of Michelangelo, who, again, comes right after these two artists. Michelangelo's father didn't know how to paint or draw. They didn't have art schools in the Renaissance. So how did Michelangelo get his training? to him? How did he learn? From somebody else, right. And what we start to see at this time period is that, again, there's still not a formal art school where people who have an interest in art and painting, sculpture, whatever, can go to a school and take courses. But what happened, and specifically in the case of Michelangelo, is that at a very young age, he started to show artistic ability. By the age of 8, he started to show superb skill in drawing. So it was proper and common at that time then to take that child of 8 or 9 and place them into the studio of what we call a master artist or a master craftsman. The master craftsman studio would be used in the same sense of an apprenticeship. The young Michelangelo would become an apprentice to the master craftsman and his other apprentices that step up the ladder. And if you're familiar with the medieval guilds, they basically work the same way. You would learn your craft by being an apprentice to someone who had the skill, talent, knowledge to teach you. And you would work side by side with that master craftsman. You would step up as, of course, the years you spent in that workshop or studio increased, your knowledge increased. Michelangelo started sweeping the floors in the studio. I mean, you have to start somewhere. He swept the floors and cleaned up after the other apprentices. And then gradually you start to get your education. You are taught how to make your own brushes, how to crush pigments, how to mix your pigments with your binders, painting techniques, sculpting techniques. And they learn this as they grow. So that by the time they're 18 or 20, they are, if they're good enough, ready to leave the studio and go out on their own. And if they go out on their own, then sometimes, like in the case of Botticelli, you can become court painter to a very wealthy family and you're set for life. Or in the case of Perugino apprenticed up to the position to where he went out on his own, started his own studio, started to get his own apprentices, and he started churning out painting after painting after painting for wealthy patrons and the church. And when we look at Christ delivering the keys to St. Peter, and it is by Perugino, the only thing that's originally done by Perugino is the fact that his drawings were used for this painting. It was his idea to come up with the composition. He decided what colors were going to be used, how many people would be included, and what would appear in the distance. But as far as how he actually touched a brush to the wall of the Sistine Chapel, is that Perugino more than likely only painted the foreground. And he was responsible for the most important details, while the rest of his apprentices worked on the background and filled in the rest. So that what happens is, these younger students who are being trained, not only are they being trained by a master craftsman, but they are being trained to duplicate exactly the style of the master craftsman. Because if you have 20 people working on one painting, it has to be orchestrated, there has to be cohesiveness. They are going to have to create in the same stylistic manner so that it doesn't look disjointed as if it does, as if it was painted by 15 or 20 different artists. So what we're going to see with Perugino is there was a very young apprentice working for him at this time, and he came in and he was responsible just for painting in the trees. That's all he could do because he was, kind of down a little bit lower on the scale here. But this young artist, his name is Raphael. Have you heard of Raphael? A great 16th century painter. You don't hear as much about his work than Michelangelo and Leonardo, only because he died very suddenly at I think he was 27 or 32. He was extremely young. He took ill, and 2 days later he was dead. So that's why we don't hear his name as often. But what we're going to see is that these artists kind of like become the trailblazers. Perugino, Botticelli, and the other artists in the 15th century, they're starting to be a little more creative on their own. They're still restricted a lot to, who's paying them to do the work. They don't have total creative expression, but they have more than, let's say, the other craftsmen did throughout time. And what we're going to see is that this will be progressively increasing from generation to generation to generation. Michelangelo was a rebel. He definitely went counterculture. He resisted authority. He always challenged the Pope on almost every project that he was hired to do. And in part, this led to the reason why he never got paid for painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But from this point, we can move forward. And again, I mentioned this last week. We will emphasize modern art, but I think it's important to kind of understand where some of these artists have been so that we can understand where they are right now. And again, understand a Picasso and why is a Picasso worth so much money, or a Van Gogh painting worth $83 million. That's basically where we're going to try to end up. So I'll see you on Wednesday. Again,